Welcome to Reading Rule, y'all, where we talk about all things rural YA literature and to the rural authors who write it. I'm your host, Dr. Shay Parton, and I'm excited to talk to you about today's topic at hand. If you're a teacher, student, or community member in a rural community, my hope is that the content here honors you and your experiences by discussing and analyzing books that can serve as a mirror for you. If you're an urban or suburban teacher, student, or community member, this series is for you too, and I hope that it can provide nuance to the stereotypical depictions of rural people so often seen in popular media. So come on in, and let's get to it. Well, it has warmed up pretty significantly down here in Texas, but I'm still thinking about winter. Welcome back to the show, y'all. Today, I'm going to be talking about one way I might consider teaching Shannon Dittemore's Winter, White, and Wicked. That's kind of a lie. I'm going to talk about two ways. Last episode, I talked a lot about how the world of winter has corollaries to our own world, and that students could talk about how they see those connections between the two. They could talk about this in small groups or as a whole class in something like a Socratic seminar or a fishbowl discussion, or a series of them that focused on a chapter or a section of text. And I've written more about this, including questions that I would ask, in Michelle Boyd-Waters' Rethink ELA blog. And there's a link to that in the description below. So that's one way, but what I really want to talk about today is thinking about how place is built. One essential aspect of fantasy books is world building, and I talked about how maybe I don't like fantasy books because of that very function, that they need to build their worlds, because I'm a bit impatient, and I don't know, I think that might be one of my issues, but anyway. One of the essential aspects of fantasy books is world building. And so there has to be some kind of cosmology, some kind of cosmogony where we learn how the world of the book was formed. And this can go back as far as, the way the land was built. So in Winter, White, and Wicked, the way that the islands came to be. There has to be some sort of understanding of like when the world came to be, how the world came to be, and what it looks like at the time of our reading of it. And sometimes we learn about that through histories, and all places have history. And sometimes we learn those histories of our own places, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes all we know are the history that we have with the place. When I was in elementary school, an old lady, at the time I felt like she was an old lady. She had gray hair, but now I have gray hair and I don't feel like an old lady. So, take that with a grain of salt. She came to talk to us about the history of Gaston, where I'm from. And then it was called Gaston because there was a pocket of natural gas discovered in like the mid-19th century. And being says that natural gas was all the rage at the time and still is kind of now even, the town formed around that economic possibility of the gas. She had albums of black and white pictures and horses and buggies, and she had all of this knowledge of why the town came to be and who settled there and why they settled there, and that it kind of, went bust, that the pocket was really small. And I remember her talking about like street lamps and electricity, and how everybody had such high hopes, for this area and this big economic boom that was supposed to come but never did because that pocket was so small. And so the folks who moved there, instead of moving away, although some did, a lot of them took to farming the land around them instead. And there was a mill in town whose only the remnant of its existence is some ruins and a restaurant whose name references it. And if you're not from the place and you don't know that the mill was there, then you don't really understand why the Mill Street Inn is called the Mill Street Inn. I still don't know why it's called an inn. Like, I don't know if there was a hotel there before. When I, living there as long as I did, it was only ever a restaurant. So I was always confused as to why it was the Mill Street Inn. We always just called it the mill. But anyway, so I would have never known any of that if it weren't for this woman who came and shared this history with me and the rest of my elementary school when I was in like 3rd grade. And that's all I remember of it. And maybe she shared more, but when histories don't get repeated to you and they aren't told over and over and over again to you, then you don't learn them and remember them as much as you would have if it would have been like a recurring aspect of your identity building to know that place. So the Mill Street, which is Gaston's oldest restaurant, also helped maintain and remind us of our history because they kept old yearbook photos of classes long graduated from Gaston High School in the 30s and 40s before it was consolidated with Harrison High School to become West Delaware County Schools, which is now known as West Del Community Schools, which is where I went to school. And now there's an ice cream shop in town called the Barking Cow that does something similar with more recent graduates. There's pictures everywhere and Letterman jackets and all of these sort of artifacts of West Del history, of Gaston history in the place of the Barking Cow. And so it sort of serves as this like time capsule and like mini museum, as well as a delicious ice cream place. If that doesn't have some mythical potential, then I don't know what does. And so I was thinking about the old woman and how, like, what would she be? Would she be some kind of seer or fate or oracle telling us about our past? Would it be like a tutor with a sparkly eye like Mr. Diffan in Winter? I don't know. But it would be fun to find out, and it would give students the opportunity to study genre conventions in a way that allows them to apply those to their own writing. And so I just keep thinking about like what that story of me learning about Gaston's history would look like in the fantasy realm, in the fantasy genre. And so I thought, why not offer students the opportunity to create their own fantasy worlds that are deeply connected to their own histories of their own places. So this is how I do it. Before beginning Winter, White, and Wicked, students and I would talk about both the fantasy genre and the power of place in our reading and writing, so that we made sure that those two things are connected, because place is powerful in fantasy books, and if the world isn't good or the world building isn't sufficient enough, then the novel doesn't read as well, right? Because you can't connect to it as much as if you could have if the world felt really real. So we would talk about that. We would talk about how place impacts us as readers and writers, as well as how it's imperative to genres like the fantasy genre. And then we talk about how we're always reading and writing our places, as well as the lenses we've developed through our living in them. So we're always seeing the word and the world through our place, as well as continuing to build our place through those practices. As we read Winter, White, and Wicked, whether we did it as a whole class or spent a lot of our times discussing in small groups, I would ask them to pay particular attention to how Dittemore builds the world of the novel through histories, and give them either a graphic organizer they could use, or ask them to sort of draw one that made sense for them in their reader's notebooks to keep track of where those world and history building moments happen throughout the book, because they're going to be writing their own fantasy versions of their place after we finish reading the book. So once we finished the novel, students would be given time and opportunity to research the history of their own places, whether they wanted to look state, county, town, land, house. They could zoom out or zoom in as far as they would like. And then they could use what they learned in their research as the basis for their own world building work. They could use the local library. They could reach out to local historians. I feel like small towns especially always have them, and learn about like how where they're from came to be and why it exists in the way that it does now, and then use that to think about how they would write it, how they would build the world that they're in currently in a fantasy book. So once they collect those bits and pieces of history, they're going to put them in their writer's notebooks, and then they're going to use that information to turn it into their own fantasy account of their place. Now, the Barking Cow that I mentioned before in Gaston did something similar to this in a story they tell about how they got their name. So if you want to learn more about that or see sort of a template of like what this could look like, maybe, you can read more about that on my Literacy in Place blog, and I will provide a link to that in the description below. Pairing students reading and writing like this helps them study the craft of writing and the genre conventions of what they're reading in the context of both reading and writing and their places. So all three of those things. It gives them time and space to develop their active reading skills and apply what they learned to their own writing in a way that acknowledges where they're from and where they are. And plus it's fun, you know? Learning should be fun. So like all these episodes, I'm leaving it wishing I was still in my rural classroom so I could teach this, because I think my kids would be super into it. I remember having students who knew the history of Southern Wells and the consolidation that happened, whose grandparents were sort of part of that. They knew stuff about the gym and how it was built, and they knew stuff about their community, and they knew stuff about the history of their community, and so I think they would have really enjoyed this. Thanks for being with us today. And I hope you'll join us next week for the author talk featuring Shannon Dittemore herself. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this week's episode. If you like what you heard and want to support the show and keep it a viable endeavor for me, it'd be great if you would like and comment on the YouTube episode. You could talk about what you liked most or what you walked away with. It'd also help if you'd subscribe to the channel. You can also head over to the Support Us page on the Literacy in Place website. There you can learn about all the different ways you can support this work. Like, you can like and follow the website itself, find out where to engage with us via social media, and go leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Or you could shop our storefront on bookshop.org to get the book featured in this episode or any other books that catch your eye. You could also buy us a coffee at ko-fi.com and donate once or set up a recurring donation. All of this would be immensely helpful in keeping this show going. So thanks a bunch for doing what you can. Well, that's it for this episode. Until next time, y'all come back now, would ya?